Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today I want to talk about some Hollywood CIA clandestine services murders that occurred in Hollywood. And I'm going to focus on three in particular, but I'm going to name 8 Hollywood murders that look like they have CIA fingerprints on them. And we'll start with Marilyn Monroe. That was in 1962. Marilyn Monroe, upon her death, which was ruled acute barbiturate poisoning by none other than the mysterious Japanese gentleman Thomas Noguchi. Thomas Noguchi, who magically was able to immigrate to the United States after World War II and worked his way into being a medical examiner for Los Angeles County. And at age 35, he concluded that Marilyn Monroe died of acute barbiturate poisoning. Now, there's a lot of particular details we're not going to get into on that, but I believe that was a murder. It was ruled acute barbiturate poisoning, and then the media and the district attorney's office said, well, it looked like a suicide. So then Thomas Noguchi was quoted as saying that he didn't find any evidence that contradicted that statement, meaning that he endorsed the suicide cover story. So Marilyn Monroe has been known as a suicide, and I'm calling poppycock on that. Marilyn Monroe was murdered, 1962. The next murder that I'll run through the murders real quick and then I'll circle back. So Marilyn Monroe, number 1. Number 2 is in May 5th, 1968. We had a very, very successful Hollywood actor in film and television. He went by Albert Dekker. His true name is Thomas Albert Dekker. And on May 5th, 1968, he was 62 years old. I should mention that Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old when she was murdered, and Thomas Dekker was 62 years old when he was murdered in his Hollywood apartment, not too far away from Lino LaBianca, where he was murdered, in that general section of the Silver Lake part of Los Angeles. It's Hollywood, but it's on the east side of the Hollywood Freeway, Highway 101. So it's not West Hollywood. He was sort of East Hollywood, if there is such a place. But walking distance to the Dolby Theater, walking distance to the Magic Castle, was Thomas Dekker. Now, Marilyn Monroe was murdered over where Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered, off of San Vicente Boulevard in Brentwood. So let's be clear, that's west of Beverly Hills. That's west of the San Diego Freeway, not far. Slightly west of the San Diego Freeway, south of Sunset Boulevard, not far south, in close proximity to Sunset Boulevard, and north of San Vicente Boulevard was Marilyn Monroe. And Thomas Dekker over there by the Hollywood sign, below the Hollywood sign, his apartment could look up at the Hollywood sign from outside the front of his apartment. Going to come back to him. Then number 3 is Jack Cassidy. You remember him. He married Shirley Jones. Jack Cassidy is the father of David Cassidy, the heartthrob that went on to be in the Partridge Family, along with Shirley Jones, who's not his mother. That's his stepmother, because Jack Cassidy was married and divorced twice. Married and divorced twice. And David Cassidy was born with wife number 1 of Jack Cassidy. Then Jack Cassidy married Shirley Jones after a year of dating, and they produced 3 boys. And then they had their own television shows also. And Jack Cassidy appeared in 3 Columbo Murder Detective episodes where Jack Cassidy played the murderer. He was murdered on December 12th, 1976. I don't know who examined him. I know that Thomas Noguchi examined Thomas Albert Dekker. We don't have an examiner named for Jack Cassidy. It could have been Thomas Noguchi. Again, this is December 12th, 1976. Next murder I'm going to list is Sharon Tate. She was murdered, as you know, August 9th, 1969. Thomas Noguchi performed the autopsy on Sharon Tate, who was working with CIA as a social engineering actress for television and film for Hollywood, who's not renewing her contract and who's pregnant and not getting an abortion. 2 months after Sharon Tate's murder, we have the Diane Linkletter being thrown off her 6th floor apartment on North Horn Avenue. She's thrown onto the sidewalk right across the street from 1121 North Horn Avenue. Now that's important, 1121 North Horn Avenue, because 4 days after Diane Linkletter is declared dead, don't know who did the medical examination. It's not that complicated. She was thrown 6 floors to her death onto the sidewalk from the Shoreham Towers. Check it out. Anyway, 4 days later after her memorial service, her neighbor from across the street at 1121 North Horn Avenue, a Connie Monti, who's married and is 31 years old, who attended the memorial services along with Ed Durston, who's 27 years old, who was in the kitchen baking cookies with Diane Linkletter when she dived off of the 6th floor, allegedly committing suicide, right? Connie Monti takes sleeping pills and she dies of acute barbiturate poisoning, and she lives right across the street at 1121 North Horn Avenue. Now that's an important address, people, because that apartment building is chock full of CIA operatives. I think only CIA people live in that building. Ed Durston lives in that building. He's the one that murdered Diane Linkletter a few days earlier. He's the one whose name appears in the Abigail Folger's Black Book, which means he's on the payroll for Abigail Folger's CIA banking, private banking compensation. And that means that he should be implicated in the death of Connie Monti, who's his neighbor, who's his apartment neighbor in the same building they live in. And the Jack Cassidy murder that I'm telling you about, guess what the address was where Jack Cassidy was living? You're never going to believe it. 1121 North La Cienega Boulevard. It's 600 yards away from 1121 North Horn Avenue. Okay, they're in the same neighborhood, okay? And they have the same address on different streets. They're about 2 blocks apart. So Jack Cassidy is murdered, 1976, so that's 7 years later. But the point is that that's a message, right? After he gets divorced with Shirley Jones, he ends up, downgrading and living in an apartment not too far from the Comedy Store. There's not a lot funny about murder, people, but it is true that Diane Linkletter died really close to the Comedy Store. So did Connie Monti. So did Jack Cassidy. All walking distance to the Comedy Store. And there's nothing funny about it. That's a message, right? And three out of, they all live in close proximity to 1121 something. All three for three. All right, so then we have John Zywer, who's Art Linkletter's son-in-law. He's murdered at age 33 by a .38 caliber pistol in West Hollywood. That's on July 15th, 1969. I don't know who did the medical exam. It could have been Thomas Noguchi. All of these deaths I'm telling you about, Thomas Noguchi was working in the medical exam office on all of these autopsies. Then the 8th murder is Inger Stevens, who was murdered at age 35. She has a kind of a Sharon Tate history background, and but she lived a little bit longer than Sharon Tate. As you remember, Sharon Tate was murdered at age 26, and Inger Stevens was murdered at age 35. She did films Hang 'em High with Clint Eastwood. She appeared in films with Bing Crosby and Anthony Quinn, whom she had affairs with. She had an affair with Bing Crosby. She had an affair with Anthony Quinn. She had an affair with Burt Reynolds, who was the last person to see her alive. Burt Reynolds of Deliverance. Burt Reynolds of Smokey and the Bandit. That Burt Reynolds. He's in the Inger Stevens orbit. Anyway, Thomas Noguchi did perform Inger Stevens' autopsy, and he ruled it, you won't be surprised, the same as Marilyn Monroe: acute barbiturate poisoning, suicide. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, younger woman, older men is a theme. Another is spooks are recruited from different recruiting hubs, one being, the Ivy League, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, Columbia University, New York, Stanford University, University of California Systems, UCLA, Berkeley, Santa Cruz, Irvine. And then for actors that don't attend college, the Actors Studio in New York, that is a CI recruiting center and an indoctrination center of its own. Well, you won't be surprised, Inger Stevens attended that. John Houseman had something to do with that. Peter Falk went there. John Cassavetes went there. It's the who's who of Hollywood went there. The murders of these 8 that I'm going to focus on right now is Albert Dekker. Albert Dekker, who I'm going to call Thomas Albert Dekker. I'm going to look at Jack Cassidy, because I loved his appearances in Columbo. And I'm going to focus on Inger Stevens, 35-year-old blonde woman. Those 3. All right, so real quickly, so the Thomas Albert Dekker situation, he did over 100 Hollywood films. He appeared in, you name it, television shows. You can check out his background. It's quite impressive. He's not very well known for being so successful and being in more films than your average Hollywood superstar. He was very successful. Anyway, because I have limited time here and I'm having lots of problems uploading my videos to BitChute, I'm going to try to make this video shorter. So, long story boring, he'd only been married one time in his life. Most of these people seem to marry within the Hollywood or entertainment community, which I'm telling you right now, that's a cult. Just like the banking and the arranged marriage, like the Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi, I believe that was an arranged marriage. Nancy D. Ambrosia. I think that's an arranged marriage. I got it wrong. Nancy D. Alessandro, who's the Speaker of the House that no one listens to. The Speaker who wears a face diaper when she's on the camera, and then she takes it off when she's going and supervising weddings and when she's living her life. All right, so anyway, what we have here is Thomas Albert Dekker was living in an apartment, which is kind of confusing because he was a pretty successful guy. He did get divorced, and he was dating Geraldine Saunders. Now, you may not recognize that name, but she wrote the scripts she created and produced and wrote scripts for the Love Boat television series. But before that, she's a much younger woman than was Albert Dekker. Because when Albert Dekker was murdered, he was 62 and Geraldine Saunders was 44 years old. So there's an 18-year age difference there. And Albert Dekker had quite a collection of bondage equipment in his apartment. And Geraldine Saunders admitted that she participated in bondage sex with Albert Dekker when she was interviewed by police detectives after the very bizarre murder of her boyfriend. Albert Dekker's last Hollywood film that he appeared in was The Wild Bunch. Now that's important because that was a film that William Holden appeared in. William Holden, who was murdered, in November 1981. Hasn't happened yet, but William Holden was murdered at age 63. William Holden was dating a much younger woman, Stephanie Powers, right? Stephanie Powers, who was, I believe, 25 years younger than William Holden. Stephanie Powers, not her real name. She's a Polish-Jewish girl who went to Hollywood High School. Stephanie Powers, who's 2 years older than Sharon Tate. Stephanie Powers, who's Nancy Sinatra's age, who went to school at Hollywood High School briefly when Nancy Sinatra was attending Hollywood High School. She transferred out, whereas Stephanie Powers was a cheerleader and graduated from Hollywood High School. And she is a Polish Jewish girl who changed her name to Powers. And she's dating a 25-year-old man, William Holden, who's 63 years old. And that would make Stephanie Powers about 39 years old. Right? That adds up. 38 years old. It's remarkable, isn't it? 25-year age difference. And more disturbing is that Stephanie Powers, who had a 9-year relationship with William Holden as a young woman, she's working with Robert Wagner for 5 years. For 5 years on Heart to Heart television show. And you know that 13 days after Stephanie Powers' boyfriend, William Holden, is murdered, Natalie Wood is murdered. And the only people who could have done it is Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, or the skipper of the yacht. And I don't think he did it. So, I don't know why Christopher Walken would do it. He was working on a CIA film, Brainstorm, with Natalie Wood. Now, what do you think the mathematical probability is, people, that Stephanie Powers is working directly and closely with Robert Wagner, whose wife is murdered, less than 2 weeks after her boyfriend is murdered? It's a bang bang, right? That's 1981. But in 1968, on May 5th, after a series of phone calls, I think by Geraldine Saunders, the apartment manager lets some people into the apartment, and they find Thomas Albert Dekker naked in the bathroom. There's no window in this particular bathroom in this apartment, this upstairs apartment. And I have the address here somewhere, but the point is that Thomas Dekker is naked in the bathroom. He's handcuffed. Allegedly, the key is still in the handcuffs, but he's handcuffed naked. He has a ball gag in his mouth with a steel strap. He's blindfolded. He's blindfolded with some kind of bandana or something over his eyes. He has 3 leather bondage straps on his chest and abdomen. He has profane language written in red lipstick all over his body, which I won't repeat on this video. It's quite graphic. And he has syringes, allegedly a syringe injected into each arm. I don't know what's inside the syringe. So he's pacified. He has a noose around his neck that's attached to the shower curtain. It's not exactly the sturdiest thing to hang yourself, but it's taut. And the coroner, in this case Thomas Noguchi, rules this suffocation, that he suffocated because of the asphyxiation triggered by the rope attachment to the shower curtain, which I'm here to tell you, in real life, this could never happen. This could never happen in real life. Shower curtains are very flimsy, and if you're fighting for your life, you could get out of the situation even if you're handcuffed. Now, if there is a murderer present supervising this and you're sedated, which I believe they were, then you could suffocate, of course, yes. And that's what I believe would happen. I believe that Thomas Albert Dekker was pacified in much the same way that William Colby was when he was murdered, either in or out of his cabin in Rock Point, Maryland. He could have been murdered at a different location, but he needed to be pacified. Same as Roberto Calfi, needed to be pacified. The same as Lino LaBianca, needed to be pacified. He's a military policeman. He's 6 feet tall. He's 235 pounds. He has 6 loaded weapons in his mother's home in close proximity to him. He needs to be pacified, right? And he was. And so was Thomas Albert Dekker. He was pacified. Then he was stripped naked, tied up with the bondage stuff, handcuffed, and put in the shower, and then had these profane messages written all over his chest and abdomen with the red lipstick, blindfolded, and then suffocated out. And I'm sure the killer stayed there until there was no more pulse, no more heart rate. Then they left. And, you know, he'd been there for a few days, right? This is just like the William Holden. If you watch my William Holden video, you know, Stephanie Powers I caught her in a couple of, appears to be, you know, like William Shatner lies. Because she said she called William Holden her boyfriend for 9 years. She called him every day. Except that his body was dead for 2 to 3 days before it was found. So how could she call him every day if he's not answering the phone every day because he's dead? And then Stephanie Powers said, "Oh, I heard about the murder on my car radio." Oh, okay. I gotcha. I thought you talked to him every day, Stephanie. Oh, but she was in Hawaii. I see. So she's in Hawaii listening to a car radio. It's just like William Holden. I mean, his alibi is really, I mean, we're not going to get into that, but I would look back at the William Shatner alibi. I mean, it's more lame than I thought it was. It's his Columbo episode alibis were 1,000 times more powerful. All right. Well, anyway, so I'm telling you that Thomas Albert Dekker was murdered. He was put into a bondage scenario situation in the bathtub. He was medicated. He has syringes into his arms, and he was suffocated from a garrote, like John Benet Ramsey was, like Sharon Tate was, like Tom Coomer, Jay Sebring was. It's a common theme. Like David Carradine was, right? Like Robin Williams was, right? Like Jersey's Kaczynski was. That's a lot of garroting. Jersey's Kaczynski, Robin Williams, Sharon Tate, Tom Coomer, Jay Sebring, Thomas Albert Dekker, David Carradine. That's 6. That's 6. So that seems to be a theme in Hollywood clandestine service murder, garroting. Oh, Roberta Calfee, that's 7. Roberta Calfee, forgot him. Got to remember my private bankers, my favorite perverted group of people, the private bankers. All right, so I could go on with this. I can tell you that Geraldine Saunders told the Los Angeles Police Department that $70,000 of cash that Thomas Albert Dekker kept in his apartment was missing. $70,000 in 1968? I mean, that's an absurd amount of money. That's like $1 million today. Can you imagine having $1 million in cash in your apartment, in your little flimsy apartment in Hollywood, below the Hollywood sign? Yeah, 70 grand missing. Geraldine went on to success with the Love Boat. The Love Boat. But not before her boyfriend went bye-bye in bondage in the bathroom, in the bathtub. It's what I call bondage, bathtub, homicide. All right. The thing that troubles me most about the Thomas Albert Dekker was he was in The Wild Bunch, which starred William Holden. But if you go to Wikipedia and look it up, he's been deleted. And there's no doubt that Albert Dekker was one of the actors in that film. He played a character called Pat Harrington, who was the corrupt railroad detective. Because The Wild Bunch was about a bunch of criminals that robbed trains. And Pat Harrington was one of the cops that would go and investigate these crimes. And but there's no mention of Albert Dekker. And that is, he's conspicuously absent. And he did his filming in this Sam Peckinpah movie in 1968. The film was not actually released until 1971. So it was about a year after. It was May 1971. It was 1970, pardon me. It's 2 years after his death. the film was released, 2 years after his death, and they just deleted him. But he is in the Wild Bunch with William Holden. And I think it's notable that William Holden was murdered in 1981 and that Albert Dekker was murdered in 1968, and they were both in the Wild Bunch, and they're both dated much younger women. Okay? Because Albert Dekker is dating Geraldine Saunders, who's 18 years younger, and William Holden is dating Stephanie Powers, who's 25 years younger. And Stephanie Powers is working with Robert Wagner, whose wife Natalie Wood gets murdered at 3 o'clock in the morning at Santa Catalina Island, and she's 43 years old, and she's murdered. Okay. Let me move on. East of Eden is another film that Thomas Albert Dekker was in. He was also in Machete, which featured a Star Trek actress from Star Trek, Andrea Drum, who is a much younger woman. She's 2 years younger than a year younger than Sharon Tate, so she's kind of like Stephanie Powers' age. She was in Russians Are Coming. She was a Clairol model. She was a hostess for a surfing television show. She was a child model from age 6. She was part of the Ford, Eileen Ford fashion agency. As you know, was Dakota Johnson. As you know, was Dakota Johnson's grandmother, Tippi Hedren, was. So was Andrea Dunn, who appeared with Albert Dekker in Machete, and also Come Spy With Me in 1967, a spook film about spook activities. Anyway, Andrea Dunn, as far as I know, she's still alive, so she didn't get whacked. But her co-star did. All right, so then let's turn our attention to the next one. The next murder, which I'm going to say is Jack Cassidy. Okay, Jack Cassidy, who played the great Santini, which was the CIA hiding in plain view at the Magic Castle on Franklin Avenue. You know, where Janis Joplin was murdered. You know, where Charlie Manson, whose real name is Charlie Scott had an apartment, 1959. Charlie Scott and Charlie Watson, who everybody loved, Charlie Watson. He had an apartment where the parking lot is for the Magic Castle now, and Bernard Crowe did. This is right across the street from the fake bitch slap from Will Smith to Chris Rock, right across the street. The Magic Castle, you know, where we capture your imagination and then we thereby capture you, right? Magic Castle. Well, Jack Cassidy played a magician who was the star, the great Santini, who was really a Nazi spook, member of the Gestapo. And this is Jack Cassidy in Colombo. Anyway, he's married to Shirley Jones for 18 years, and they have 3 children. Again, Jack Cassidy marrying within the Hollywood cult. Same with Shirley Jones. After Shirley Jones divorces Jack Cassidy, she marries a Jewish fellow who's also in the Hollywood cult, a comedian, actor. And she has a on-again, off-again marriage with him, but he dies recently, 2015, I believe he passed away. Forgot his name. Anyway, so Shirley Jones was married and divorced once, married and filed for divorce but didn't close it out. So she is only divorced one time, and she had 3 sons with Jack Cassidy. So Jack Cassidy, again, downgrades, moves into an apartment, again, in close proximity to Diane Linkletter, where she lived. He's living at 1121 North La Cienega Boulevard. And, you know, he's pretty active in those Colombos. He did 3 of them. He's very active in lots of television. He has theatrical background in New York, and he directs as well as acts. Very talented man. He's 49 years old. Anyway, if we believe the story, right near where Fountain Avenue tees into La Cienega Boulevard, just below Sunset Boulevard, where this apartment is at 1121 North La Cienega Boulevard, he goes out to dinner alone, if you believe that, and may or may not have had anything to drink. Can't really verify that. And he retires to his apartment, which is, I believe, on the third floor. It's a three-story. It was a three-story apartment building. I believe it still is a three-story, but they've remodeled it, so it looks slightly different today. It's had a facelift. And he's on the third floor, and sort of like Albert Dekker was on the upper floor, he falls asleep on his couch, which is a Naugahyde saddle leather couch, which is not a comfortable thing to fall asleep on. So the implication is that he was like really drunk and he fell asleep on his uncomfortable couch in front of the fireplace. I don't know if there was a fire going on. It's December 12th, 1976. So it's possible that there was a fire in the fireplace. And it's alleged in the media that he had a lit cigarette that he didn't extinguish. How would they know? How would the media know that? How would anyone know that? I don't think you could ever tell. Anyway, his apartment goes up into a blaze. And the fire department arrives at 6:30 a.m. So it's not like the fire was in a blaze, when you come home from the bars, because that'd be, let's say, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Why would it take 4 hours to have your apartment go up in a blaze? So I'm thinking that he was murdered, and then a structured fire was set using incendiary devices at around 6 a.m. in the morning. Then the killer would have left. Then the fire department would have been summoned, which is what happened. The fire department arrived at 6:30 a.m. on December 12th, 1976, and they find what they think is Jack Cassidy. It's completely burned beyond recognition. But he had his signet ring, which is a cult ritual membership ring, in case you don't know what a signet ring is. And then dental records were used to identify the body of what they attributed to be Jack Cassidy. So no more Jack Cassidy. But I'm calling that a murder because there is no way, if you lit a carton of cigarettes using a blowtorch and put it on a Naugahyde couch or on a shag rug, that you're going to burn your apartment down. No way. No way. And burn his body beyond recognition, that you would need dental records to identify him. He didn't die of smoke inhalation. He died from some other way, and his body was cremated, essentially. It's a cremation. He dies from cremation, partial cremation. I don't know what else to say about Jack Cassidy, but that was a murder, people. That was a murder. All right, and that's in 1976. Then let's go back in time and talk about Inger Stevens. She's murdered on April 30th, 1970. Her real name, of course, is different. It's Ingrid Stensland, and she had a very disruptive childhood. So that's another recruiting example. She went to the actor's studio later in life, but after she was 18 years old. But she had a very disruptive childhood. Her father ended up getting a PhD from Columbia University, and that is what took Inger Stevens away from Sweden and over to New York, was reconnecting with her father there. She didn't stay there long. Once he finished his PhD, got a teaching job in Manhattan, Kansas, and that took Inger Stevens at age 16 out to Kansas. And then as soon as she turned 18, she went back to New York City, where she did burlesque dancing and attended the actor's studio, which is perfect for the spooks, right? They're looking for narcissistic or desperate or people who have daddy complexes, which she has a daddy complex. Sharon Tate had a daddy complex. Natalie Wood had a daddy complex. They want that. They want that. They want the younger woman, older men, because I think they want the younger women to be surveillance agents for the older men, to tell you the truth. I think that's one of the many jobs that these girls get. they go to modeling school, they get photo shoots, they do the Playboy centerfolds, they go hang out with Hugh Hefner, then they're attached or get married to an older man. And that's what happened to Inger Stevens, who was married and divorced twice to older men, then has an affair with Bing Crosby, who's a much older man, and another affair with Anthony Quinn, who, by the way, they threw Sharon Tate at him. They threw Sharon Tate at Anthony Quinn in 1960 when she was only 17 years old. They threw a 17-year-old Sharon Tate at Anthony Quinn. Then a few years later, they throw Ingrid Stevens at Ben, and she has an affair with him. I don't know if Sharon Tate did. I mean, she's only 17. She's in high school in Verona, Italy, at the American School for Spooks. And yeah. So Inger Stevens, she has a long list of trysts. And her last one is with Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds is dating Inger Stevens in 1970. Anyway, it's she comes home, and it's April 30th, 1970. Evidently, Burt Reynolds visited her in her apartment in West Hollywood, and they had an argument, and Burt left, and then I think that's part of the applied linguistics, is that then Inger Stevens consumed like 50 barbiturate pills, which led Thomas Noguchi to conclude that it was acute barbiturate poisoning, right? Now, she had had a previous incident of sleeping pills. She took 25 sleeping pills, allegedly, in 1959. So 11 years earlier, when she was 24 years old, she allegedly had a attempt of suicide. And then they played that back in 1970, where she actually did die. And at age 35, she's dead. And the last person to see her alive was Burt Reynolds. Now, allegedly, the roommate found Inger Stevens, and Inger Stevens opened her eyes and looked like she was going to speak, but couldn't utter a word, allegedly, and then died. And Thomas Noguchi did the autopsy. And I'm calling that a murder, not a suicide. All right, so there you go. Those are the 3 of the 8. I think they're all murders. I think they're all Hollywood murders. And it's just that those particular 3 involved Thomas Noguchi doing the autopsy. I mean, Sharon Tate would be a 4th one. She was bayoneted 16 times to death and hung by a rope. So the bayoneting is what killed her, because she had these 6-inch deep bayonet wounds. That's what killed her, not the hanging from the rope. I think that was more for display purposes. Like in the case of Thomas Dekker. I mean, he may have actually died from whatever was injected into his body. And then I don't know that he suffocated like Thomas Noguchi says. See, I don't really believe anything Thomas Noguchi says anymore, because I know he's under a lot of pressure ever since the Robert Kennedy assassination, where he did push back and he got fired. He lost his job. And it took him 9 months to get his job back once they got Noguchi back under control, because Noguchi was sort of doing what he was supposed to do, which is to lie. And then once he disobeyed, then they fired him, and then they brought him back. Thomas Noguchi has awards internationally, you should know, which I don't understand why the royalty of Japan would be bestowing awards to Thomas Noguchi as a famous Japanese doctor when he's associated with CIA Hollywood. I mean, Thomas Noguchi works for the CIA. Of course, he has to. Your district attorney for Los Angeles has to work for the CIA. So don't ever think that the Charlie Manson trial was valid. Don't think that the Suran trial was valid. Don't think that the Charlie Watson trial was valid. Don't think that the Jose and Eric and Lyle Menendez murder of their father Jose and their mother Kitty. Don't think that was a legitimate trial. Don't think that the McMartin School trial was legitimate. Don't think that the Rodney King beating trial was legitimate. The judges are in on it. The O.J. Simpson case, Ito. The McMartin School case, Stanley Weisberg. Stanley Weisberg does McMartin School. Mistrial follows him everywhere. Mistrials. He does Rodney King. Mistrials. He does Jose and Kitty Menendez murder trial. Mistrials. They never get it right. The judge is in on it. Judge Older convicts Charlie Scott Manson. That's a mendacity. Okay, the OJ trial, that was all CIA controlled. I mean, come on. When you have the next door neighbor is the son of the CIA director, that's a red flag. When you have F. Lee Bailey, who's a CIA trial lawyer, who got Captain Medina, the most senior officer present at the My Lai massacre of 504 dead people, murdered with M7 bayonets and M16 rifles, killing pigs. They killed pigs at My Lai. And you get him involved with getting an acquittal for a guy who's obviously guilty. And he gets O.J. Simpson, who's obviously guilty, who received Navy frogman training, including slitting throats, weeks before his ex-wife is murdered, Nicole Brown, and Ron Goldman is murdered. O.J. Simpson had Navy SEAL guerrilla training. That involves clandestine services. His lawyer works for clandestine services. You got Alan Dershowitz, who's a television lawyer, not a real lawyer. Alan Dershowitz, not a trial lawyer. He's a fake television lawyer, fake know-it-all, fake lecturer at Harvard, which is a spook university. I mean, he's associated with a spook university, home to Timothy Leary, home to Richard Albert, home to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. That's Alan Dershowitz, Ted Kaczynski. Graduated from Yale Law School. That's Spook University. That's where Peter Folger, Abigail Folger's father, went to Yale. That's where George H.W. Bush went. That's where George W. Bush went. That's where Chris Como went. That's where... Who else went there, right? Dick Cheney dropped out. Oliver Silverstein went to Yale. Twice! Right? So I wouldn't use Yale to brag about your law expertise when all you do is appear on television and you don't actually try cases in front of a jury. Because that's not what Alan Dershowitz does. He does appeal law. And he doesn't talk to jurors. He knows nothing about jurors. He talks to judges who are probably compromised. All right, so what I'm trying to tell you is that this is Spooksville, USA. So, of course, the judges have to be compromised, the lawyers in the courtroom are compromised, and then all the knuckleheads that appear on television who may or may not be lawyers, like Lawrence Schiller, all of the, or TMZ Harvey Levin, right? Or Mark Lane, whose real name is Levin, Mark Levin. All the phony, fake television talking heads, they're compromised. So, of course, the results in the courtroom are going to be completely based on something other than the truth. That's what we're dealing with here, people. Anyway, I'm starting to see lots of connections. The younger woman, older man, garroting, coroner reports ruling suicide or de facto suicides when they're murders or homicides. We have felony arson fires in the Anne Heche case, and we have a felony arson fire in the Jack Cassidy murder. And yet it's called something other than what it is, which is felony arson. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.